Fantastic to be here, y'all. Sorry again. This traffic in the city is interesting, but good to be here. Want to start with all the things that make this talk hard. I don't want to piss anyone off. That's not going to stop me from saying important things. I went home early to work on this last night and proceeded to leave my phone in the lift. I really want to be playing Zelda right now, as I'm sure most of us do. Who here wants to be playing Zelda? Let's see hands. Yeah, happy it's not just me. Awesome. I haven't been up this early in about 2 years, and the last time I was up this early, I was paid a lot of money to do it, and you can guess how much Jamin's paying me, so. Haven't done mobile dev in 3 years, so disregard most of my mobile opinions, because before then it was actually 6 years. Excalidra's font and Keynote don't like each other much. I've learned way too much about fonts over the last week in order to make this work. And I'm too used to YouTube to do this in a traditional presentation way, because normally, when I'm on YouTube, there's a bunch of better videos next to my video that I have to convince you to not click by being interesting every 5 seconds. Here, y'all are in a room, and if you leave, it's going to look awkward. So I can do as I please, and it's great. I can have a lot more fun with this, including lie to y'all throughout the presentation, and you can't be too mad at me. It's great. All that said, let's talk about the tech, because we have more options now than we've ever had before when we make technical decisions. And we're also expected to make more technical decisions than we've ever had to make in our careers. And as great as this is for those of us who hang out at events like this and care a lot and look into these things for fun in our free time, generally speaking, we're kind of bad at making technical decisions. I'm going to break down how we decide what tech we use into 3 columns. There's things that don't change. Think your static websites like a restaurant's website. There are things that don't change often, like the Amazon homepage. It has different content depending on the user, but generally speaking, once you've loaded the page, you expect the content to be relatively static. And there's the chaotic world I tend to live in where my life has changed. Things like games online, things like really interactive applications, where most of the content on the page is changing throughout your session. If we were to break this down to different technology choices to reference the time era all these are from, we had HTML for your really static stuff, we had PHP for your kind of changing stuff, and we had Flash for everything else. Technically, you could use Flash for your blog, and maybe you could use HTML for your game. All of those would be stupid. This is where I have to reveal the first why. There aren't actually 3 categories here. It's much more so a spectrum. And when you break it down this way, you'll see the overlap a lot more clearly between these different technologies and where they may or may not make sense. But how are PHP and Flash overlapping? One's a client-side thing, and one's certainly not. And the reason they overlap is because they shouldn't. I lied again. There's actually another axis here. And when you take those same pictures from earlier and compare different products over time, something like the restaurant site's really far in that bottom left corner. It doesn't even really have a server that it runs on. It has your computer that it's built on, and then it's just served from a server. You have content that varies wildly. Some parts are on the client, some parts are on the server. Fits somewhere roughly in the middle of this. Then you have Bloons Tower Defense, which is just a Flash game. And if, again, we break this down based on technologies, we can see the overlap between HTML and PHP, but we see Flash in its own little world. But we're not here to talk about Flash, are we? We're here to talk about React. So where does React fit? Well, React Native's really client-side. We have things like Gatsby that are client-heavy but largely static. We have things like React Core for web, which is mostly dynamic and client-side. We have things like Next.js. We have things like, I forgot what I put in this corner. It's a lot of different things that fit all over the place with React. And it's really hard to put it somewhere on a chart like this. It just doesn't really fit. And more importantly, it doesn't measure where React's strengths and weaknesses are, because it can kind of do all these things. The problem with this is that React has a high complexity floor, and this chart doesn't capture that either. It's important to understand that React is, by default, has a certain level of buy-in necessary. JavaScript running on your client, your device, rendering things in that way. There are lots of hacks to get around that, like server-side rendering with hydration and all these different ways to get your application running the way that you would expect. But those things are complex, and if you haven't had to write your own hydration or debug a weird hydration error, I envy you. It is not pleasant. And this model just does not fit the way React works. And I think they know that. I think they're challenging us to stop thinking in this way. they're partially doing that by misusing the words client and server so egregiously. But they're also doing this by challenging how we think about them in the first place. React doesn't think in client and server or static and dynamic. They're starting to think more in simple and complex, which means we don't really have these two axes. I lied again. We have one axis. And an axis doesn't really make sense because simple to complex isn't left to right. Simple is contained within complex. You can have simple parts in a complex thing. So I try to visualize this more like a circle, where the inside is the simplest possible thing, and the outside is where the complexity occurs. Center equals simple, simple equals good. By transitive property, HTML equals good. Which is why I put it in the middle of this. Wait, why is Astro there? Oh, well, who here has used Astro before, I should ask? Who here will use it again? Keep your hands up. OK, for the audience, there's about 4 people here, and there's a lot more than 4 people here, but 4 of them had their hands up, so you should try it. It's like HTML, but better. But as soon as you use something dynamic, HTML that only runs on the server is not going to help you a whole lot. You need something like React to cover it. But what if I have a mobile app and I need push notifications? Well, if Apple ever ships PWAs with push notifications, that'll be cool. I think they're supposed to in the next release, but I'll believe it when I see it. Until then, there are thin but very powerful wrappers around React for mobile apps, things like Ionic. And if that could solve the problem you have, that's awesome. If it can't and you need more native behaviors, things like that, that's what React Native is for. And as you see, this chart's getting really complex really quickly. And making your decisions gets really hard if your circle doesn't perfectly align with one of these, like mine does. So what do we do here in this situation? Either you use Astro and you embed React components, which thankfully Astro is built for. But what if I'm not sure that's where my circle is? What if my circle actually needs to move around from like the center to the right? Maybe I realize, oh, we really need a mobile app, and I have to expand it a whole bunch. It's really hard to correctly guess where your complexity lies when you start your application, and even when you iterate on it over time. Your understanding of what makes your application work, what makes your application unique, and what best serves your users is not something you know up front, even as a big business. Even if you're rewriting an old thing, you might discover new things you need to build. And if your framework for making these decisions doesn't give you the room to do that, it's a rough time. Who here has had to move a Create React app out of Create React app before? Yeah, that's about 6 times the hands that I saw for Astro. Who enjoyed the process? There is not a single hand up right now. Oh, okay, 1 hand up right now. Yeah. If you pick wrong, it sucks. And React has not done a good job of helping us get out of those situations historically. But again, I have to reveal, I lied. I said React has a high complexity floor. React had a high complexity floor. As of a couple weeks ago, React is now static by default. I think we can all agree static is roughly as simple as your thing can get, especially if it's actually static. And the new model is a lot more blue. The goal of React is to not make you have to think about when you do and don't adopt React and at what layer you use React or you don't. It's to be turtles all the way down. And the beauty of this model is it doesn't really matter where your complexity lies or how it shifts over time, as long as you use the part of this circle that makes sense for the piece that you're working on, your complexity moves along with you. React's complexity scales with you, the complexity of the things that you're building, and the goals that you have in the application that you're designing. This is a very new concept. I haven't seen a lot of frameworks that have truly embraced this idea of complexity that is scaling with you as the developer rather than a certain level of complexity that you had to buy in. Even React required that you run a lot of code on client side in order to take advantage of the framework until recently. But why is everybody upset then? Who here has heard pushback on server components? Slightly less hands than the Create React app thing. That's a surprise. Who here has used server components? The exact same hands are up right now. Says a lot. There are enthusiasts right now, like myself and like all these people. Out of the people who just raised their hands, how many of you watch my YouTube videos? Roughly the same hands again. We're still in the early cult phase. I get it. I understand. It's really fun. Try them out if you haven't yet. It's a really cool pattern. But I have concerns about how we're talking about server components. Because I think server components are a simpler model within React that if you can use it, you should. But people don't see it this way. because they already know React. They might even already know React Native. So for them, it looks more like this. I should have made a slide where I actually make the React bubble smaller and the React Server Components bubble bigger, because the more you're familiar with something, the less complex it seems inherently. When you use something every day and you're intimately familiar with its quirks, its bugs, its problems, and its solutions, it no longer feels as challenging or as big as it might be. On the other side here, React Server Components have a lot of different features built in, especially with the new server action stuff and like the 4 different things it does. We only had 1 use effect before. Now we have 15 or so similar things. They're way simpler, though. It's been my favorite part with server components is that the bugs tend to feel shallow in a way, where a use effects issue might come up months later when somebody hits an edge case that causes it to just go infinitely, and suddenly you're paying a really big bill because one person's phone recursively called something. I haven't had anything like that since I moved over to the server component model, because the logic of our applications is much simpler. The bet React made here is that your application, starting from the top node down, is static to a point for almost all apps. Even if you're working on a game, even if you're working on a mobile app, a lot of the shell, and possibly even the components within it, is largely static and only changes when the server has a reason to make it change. But we're not really here to talk about React Server Components. Who here has built a Next.js app? Who here has built a React Native app? Again, for the audience, about 3 times the hands for React Native that there were for Next. I don't think that's representative of the React community, but it's certainly representative of here. So I should probably talk about React Native. Sorry, Jamin. How do server components help React Native developers? It's a great question, and the React core team has been asking me it a lot too. I think they have some ideas. I think we do too. But I'm going to start with a rant about some UI. Who's had to implement a tab bar before? That's somehow more hands than has built with React Native. Interesting. Sensible, but interesting. Who here has had to temporarily add or remove a button from the tab bar? Weirdly close to the same number of hands. How many of you were blocked on App Store review for at least 2 weeks when you did that? Not as many hands. Good, you're all using Expo. The nature of something like your tab bar is that it's mostly static until it isn't. I think this is the most interesting part of the server component model, is that things you might have previously put in Astro or put in your HTML or put in some hacky Golang script that runs before every request to your Twitch website. Don't ask me how I was involved in that. Chaos. You have to have some level of static in your applications by nature. The problem with that is you have to have a system outside of React to define those static things, or you make them entirely dynamic and lose the benefits of static, like in web metadata. But in mobile, that doesn't matter. We don't necessarily care that the application has the right metadata when you open it. We have a bundle that ideally is already there, part of the app when you install it, that should be able to process and do whatever. But what if you need to change that tab bar? What if you coded that in a way that's static in your React app, and you want to update it later? Who here has built a pile of feature flags in order to hide and show UI for specific events at specific times? Why do we do this still? Why do we have to build systems around making static things somewhat dynamic in specific instances? All of those things are defined by the relationship between the user's device and our service, some amount. Like if we wanted to have a special 4th of July event, and we wanted to have a special button to call that out on the tab bar, we shouldn't have to wait. We shouldn't have to plan for this months ahead, hit up Apple, and hope they get our app in or out in time. Generally, if you're not adding a new feature, they don't care either, which is why OTAs have become as popular as they have. But given that a lot of your app is static, your tab bar is mostly static, your nav bar is mostly static, the background for your app and the color and all these types of things are mostly static. They're probably hard-coded in the bundle you ship to your users. You can use OTAs to handle this, or you can codify it in your application. But if you codify this in your app yourself, it gets unnecessarily complex really quickly. And that sucks. The amount of code I've seen just to make a button appear and disappear, that probably could just be called out by the server is massive. And honestly, I don't think OTA is enough for this. What if, when you requested your JSON blob or whatever from the server, instead of sending JSON, it said instructions for how to change the UI that your device is showing you right now? Most big companies are already doing something like this, where they build an abstracted rendering view layer in their application. And they have something like the chaos that Meta did with the Lightspeed project, where they use SQLite as the UI layer, and they ship SQL migrations to your device to change how the layout looks in Messenger. Absolute chaos, because you need to be able to do this, and you cannot move at the speed of Apple or Google when you're trying to ship good experiences to your users. And if you can make more of that experience defined by the relationship between your client and your server, you're making that relationship easier to reason about, maintain, and change in a way that you couldn't before. Because of the nature of React, all your static content had to be dynamic, which meant to give it behavior, you had to codify those behaviors. When React is static by default, you're able to use React's properties and how it changes by nature, and not have to offload that complexity to the application itself or even the code in your application. That can all be your server's problem. And that fundamentally changes the relationship that we have with the applications that we build. JSON is not the right primitive for us to be sending to our users. And in the same way React kind of waged war against HTML, I think server components are waging war against JSON. I'm not saying it's bad. JSON's a great solution. So is GraphQL, depending on how big your company is. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't try and find better solutions to the problems that we're solving. It doesn't mean we shouldn't reconsider what data we're sending to the client. It certainly doesn't mean we should say this is harder because it's new. I think the benefit here is that every company that has pushed mobile to its limits has built server components for mobile already in its own separate language, in its own separate code base, in its own chaotic way. Server components take the best lessons that companies like Meta, companies like Microsoft, companies like Google have all learned over a decade plus of doing this. And they package it in a way where we don't have to rebuild our mental model in order to change how many buttons are in your tab bar. That's magic. That's what I bought into React for initially. And it's incredible to see how it continues to progress and challenge our way of thinking. I never thought I would have an app where the outside comes from the server and the inside comes from the mobile device. It just feels weird. But it also gives me a level of control without increasing the complexity of my application. And that's the mind-blowing thing for me. React really does now feel like it's as simple as it can be, and your complexity comes when you want it. I somehow did this without breaking backwards compatibility. I mean, y'all in React Native land don't know what backwards compatibility is, but us in the web, we can take a class component from 2014 and run it on the server with Next.js right now, which is mind-blowing. But we need to do this for the web, for mobile, and for developers. I really believe this will let us move faster and more confidently, fix bugs for our users faster, and ship better software. I couldn't be more excited for the future of server components on mobile and how they enable us to start with a simpler thing. If your company, your team, or whoever you work with is struggling to buy into server components or React as a whole, show them the chart from earlier with the complexity thing. Ask where their solution fits, and ask where the application that you're building fits. If they're perfectly aligned, cool, take the L. But they're not. The beauty of this model is it doesn't matter as much what you're building, because React will be good enough, or often the best, for that thing. React's trying to keep us from fighting over these decisions every day. Like, do we use Astro, Vite, or create React app, Remix, Next, Gatsby? What if we just use React? I think that model is going to make these conversations much easier as time goes on. They're not going to be easy now. It might not even be easy next year. But React is giving us the tools, and I hope creators like myself can give you guys the resources necessary to convince your coworkers and teams that this model does make us better and does help us create better software. Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Jamin said I could plug upload thing, so I'm going to. We don't have React Native support yet. Who here has tried to upload something on S3 before? Keep your hand up if you got it working in under 20 minutes. I see 2 hands still up. I don't know why nobody decided to work on that. So we built Upload Thing to make it way easier. It takes you 5 minutes or less to get uploads working. They run on your server, but we still handle it through S3. Really cool solution. Really excited for us to get React Native support. All our client packages are open source. So if you want to help us, or if you all want to help us get there, I'd love the help. Check us out on GitHub. Check us out on the web, uploadthing.com. I appreciate y'all so much for the time. Who's excited to push server components way too hard at the company? That's what I thought. Thank you all so much. Really appreciate it.